Hisoka versus Kite. Who would win in a fight battle? It's actually quite a close match, but I think we have the answer. To be clear, our contenders in this match are pre-Death Kite and also pre-Death Hisoka, because post-Death Kite and post-Death Hisoka are out of this world powerful and currently impossible to quantify. Now, statistically speaking, let's just put this out there, Hisoka starts this discussion with a clear advantage. And the stats I'm referring to are the ones detailed in the data book, which assign characters a score out of 5 in the areas of mind, skill, body, nen, ingenuity, and intelligence. So what you do is you add those 6 5s together and you get a total score out of 30, with Hisoka's most recent stats from Greed Island giving him a stat score of 25 out of 30, whereas Kite lands at 23 out of 30. And that gap pretty much comes down to a single area. The difference between Hisoka and Kite is the ingenuity category. Kite's most recent score is a kind of mid 3 out of 5, whilst Hisoka's is a perfect 5. And in fact, it's Hisoka's only perfect score, which is what gives Hisoka such an edge in high-level nen combat. He's dangerously creative and never runs out of ideas. The only area where Kite is superior to Hisoka is that of mind. Here, Hisoka has a 3 and Kite has a 4. But do note that mind is not intelligence. Intelligence has its own separate category. Mind is more like the ability to remain calm and collected. So no wonder Hisoka doesn't have a high score, because that becomes increasingly difficult as the battle erection sets in. However, in every other category, skill, body, nen, and intelligence, Kite and Hisoka are completely equal. So the initial conclusion is that Kite is more composed than Hisoka, but Hisoka is significantly more creative. And this is probably one of the least straightforward matchups in Hunter x Hunter, because no one is just outright stronger, smarter, or has more aura than the other. The outcome of this fight could go either way, at least on paper, which means that a lot of this is going to come down to attrition. Who can last the longest and who has the best endgame options? And that's what makes this matchup quite exciting, because both combatants have abilities innately designed to be versatile. So much so that theoretically, both Kite and Hisoka can be in any situation and always have the right tool for the job. Kite, of course, makes use of crazy slots, and through the power of restrictions, he managed to turn a single nen ability into 9 separate nen abilities. The only problem being that Kite doesn't get to choose which one he uses at any given time. And he also has to put up with a wisecracking clown, which means that he'll have to deal with 2 clowns in this particular fight. Meanwhile, Hisoka struts gloriously into our arena equipped with bungee gum, the net equivalent of handing clay to a sculptor, because Hisoka can turn this into just about anything. Both Hatsu are weirdly versatile, but in opposite ways. Hisoka, for all intents and purposes, has one nen ability that he can use in a ton of different ways, whereas Kite effectively has a whole ton of nen abilities, however, each can only be used in a super specific way. Like Silent Waltz, for example. There is literally only one way that Kite can use the scythe, and not only that, but it must be used to dispel the scythe and be able to roll again. And this, I think, is where I'm starting to see a big problem for Kite, because realistically, I don't think Hisoka is ever getting hit by this attack. As soon as it was summoned, both Gon and Killua started shitting their nen pants because they knew that something was very, very wrong. However, it's worth noting that if Kite hadn't told them how to avoid it by jumping straight up in exactly 3 seconds, then Gon and Killua may very well have died. But also, that's because they're inexperienced, because most 11-year-olds are. Whereas I think that Hisoka is experienced enough not only to sense this feeling, but also put 2 and 2 together with the scythe. You know, what's he gonna do with that? Probably swing it, because that's the only way he can use a scythe. So let's get out of any sort of swingy trajectory and just not get hit. Sound like a good plan, Hisoka? Sounds like a great plan, other Hisoka. You always have the best plans, Hisoka. I think I love you, other Hisoka. Come here, Hisoka. That's an often forgotten aspect of Kite's abilities. He has a lot of them, but they tend to function in pretty, almost painfully straightforward ways. It's the same with Carbine. I don't think Hisoka is ever getting hit by a projectile with a predictable trajectory, which is good, very good, because to Kite's credit, I don't think Hisoka could block any of these attacks with bungee gum. Something we need to acknowledge is that all of Kite's attacks pack an insane output due to their heavy restrictions. So Hisoka isn't going to be blocking these bullets as easily as, say, Goto's coins. But when it comes to sheer versatility, fighting Hisoka using Kite's moveset would scare me. And I imagine that for Hisoka, the whole affair kind of turns into an RPG boss battle, where after a while you learn all of Kite's moves and understand how to anticipate them, because Kite can only use them in particular set ways. Meanwhile, Kite is always on edge, constantly trying to predict what kind of wacky way Hisoka's gonna use bungee gum next. I feel like if Kite is to win, it would need to be immediately, which is possible. If Kite can land a hit off any of his weapons, Hisoka is going to take serious, potential potentially even fatal damage. The problem being that the weapons we've seen so far are so easily telegraphed. A scythe that acts like a scythe and a gun that acts like a gun. So it would need to be with a weapon that we haven't seen yet. Something ideally less predictable in technique as well. Because if the other slots are all simple weapons, then they'll probably function similarly to said weapons we've already seen. Hisoka needs to be caught off guard by one of the weapons and terminated. Because every weapon Hisoka survives is going to be a dead weapon in the future. So Kite's got a grand total of 9 bites at this horny clown apple, whereas Hisoka has as many bites as his gun-based imagination will allow. So in terms of intelligence, Hisoka has an undeniable edge. Not because he's smarter than Kite, they're both about equal, but because Kite isn't allowed to plan because he never knows what weapon he's going to be allowed to use. Meanwhile, Hisoka can play it safe, bide his time, and enjoy the battle, and as soon as he sees a repeat weapon pop up, implement a counter. In a battle of attrition, I can't see Kite winning. And a lot of that comes down to the key idea of ingenuity. Hisoka isn't going to run out of ideas, whereas Kite has a set limit of ideas that are forced upon him. It's not so much that Kite isn't creative, although his points and creativity are not good, but it's more that he's heavily restricted in how he can express his creativity. Now, one obscure factor that may actually help Kite is that in chapter 1, he carried a katana. However, this weapon isn't present when he appears again during the Chimera Ant arc, and there are 2 theories for this. Number 1 is that the katana itself is actually a Crazy Slot's role. A basic sword, that would make sense. And number this one is that Togashi either forgot or didn't care and just omitted it in favor of a better idea. Considering that when drawing chapter 1, he hadn't even come close to fully conceiving of Nen yet. And I suppose an in-world explanation would probably be that Crazy Slots has another restriction that only allows the use of weapons it creates. But I only bring it up though because if Kite did have a sword as a separate non-Crazy Slots option, then it would make him slightly more versatile and slightly more able to plan against Hisoka. Something that also works well for Kite is range. From what we've seen, Hisoka almost always has an advantage in close range combat, because even in the one fight Hisoka did lose in the series, Chrollo always had to keep his distance. And from what we've seen, Kite is a naturally long range combatant, so he doesn't have to fight against Hisoka in his preferred arena. However, this is what makes Hisoka so insanely dangerous though, because he's very capable at fighting to mid to long range as well. Bungee Gum is said to have a maximum stretch limit of 10 meters, so anywhere within a 10-meter radius of Hisoka is his territory. It's a very dangerous range. And so this is one match where we should seriously consider physicality, primarily due to how even they both are in almost everything else. So Kite admittedly does look pretty scrawny, but he's not to be underestimated physically. Or is he? His feats are problematic because in the 2011 anime, he did show a high level of martial arts skill against Yunju, but that never happened in the manga. Also, allegedly Shoot had a very difficult time fighting against Kite's corpse, which is notable because the corpse couldn't use Nen at all. So it was completely vulnerable and still a formidable fighter. The problem is we don't know how much of this, if any, was Kite and how much of it was Pito's puppeteering ability. Speaking of Pito, we do know that Kite was a fighter so proficient that even though Pito won, they wanted to go at it again. And with that in mind, it's hard to see Kite as anything less than a world-class fighter, which is good for him because that's literally what Hisoka is, a floor master of Heaven's Arena and one of the most skilled battle clowns in the world. So one question you could ask is, would Hisoka have fought so well against Pito? Which is probably best saved for another video, but I think Hisoka would have done at least just as well as Kite did. We also know that Hisoka is a bit of a raw power beast. In the Phantom Troop arm wrestling rankings, Hisoka was 3rd in the entire group. Only Uvogin and Finks were physically stronger than him. And to be clear, that makes Hisoka stronger than the Hulk that is Franklin, who was 4th. In strength, both are probably roughly equal, but then again, if I had to choose, I would almost certainly give it to Hisoka. Kite is super skinny, and in the world of Nen combat, look, that's fine, because whoever can 10 Ren, Ko, and all of the other things better kind of makes physicality irrelevant. However, if we have 2 Nen users of equal skill, intelligence, and or reserves, then that becomes a different matter. Physicality all of a sudden becomes very relevant again. And I'd also say that Kite has a rather unfortunate Nen affinity for any physical-based combat against Hisoka. Hisoka is a transmuter, and Kite is a conjurer, thus making them Nen ring neighbors. However, Hisoka's natural affinity is one step closer to enhancement. So when needed, his aura investment in general enhancement is going to be more cost-effective than Kite's. So if they both had equal aura reserves, then Kite's would be depleted more rapidly. Again, in a battle of attrition, if it did unfortunately come down to a bit of a slugfest, Kite is in a terrible situation. Because physically, and even with Nen, Hisoka has the advantage. And I'm actually starting to think that Hisoka might be one of the worst possible opponents for Kite. So let's examine the field of mind, because I think that holds Kite's only real chance at victory. Consider this situation. Should Should Kite put up a good fight, which I think he would, Hisoka would naturally get aroused and potentially become vulnerable due to doing less thinking up here and more thinking down here. However, that's a bit of a trade-off because when aroused, yes, Hisoka's intelligence does drop, however, his instincts sharpen, presenting an entirely new problem for the opponent to deal with, but a problem that might not necessarily be a problem for Kite. Because Kite is a proper hunter in the more traditional sense and is exceptionally skilled with dealing with instinctual beasts. It's his entire area of expertise, and Kite's whole Hatsu is geared towards survival in the wild against dangerous instinctual powers. So the best case scenario is that with Hisoka in this state, Kite could use his superior calm and intimate experience to get the better of Hisoka while he's not thinking at 100%. But even then, I think it's a stretch. When I first started researching this video, I thought that it would be a lot more difficult to pick a winner than it is. And I'm still shocked because when I look at these discussions online, I still see the majority of people weighing in Kite's favor. Most of the arguments I see is something like, well, we don't know the rest of Kite's crazy slot moves, which, yeah, it's true, but we've got to go based on what we know. And from what we know, what I would expect are more basic weapons with very straightforward functions. They can't be anything too complex or versatile because that's the whole point of having the crazy slots restriction. Kite almost certainly has an array of single function weapons, which, while immensely powerful, don't work well against an experienced veteran like Hisoka. And so I come back to this. Kite's moveset seems developed for his hunting style, which is encountering beasts in the wild. But Hisoka's moveset is designed specifically for combat. His whole life is dedicated to fighting. They have different priorities. Hisoka is geared for PvP, whereas Kite is geared for PvE, which I think is always going to give Hisoka the edge in this sort of hypothetical matchup. In my opinion, Hisoka is stronger, more versatile, and more likely to win with each passing second of the fight. And while it's not 100% guaranteed to go Hisoka's way, yes, he could get caught off guard, I do still think that the odds are very much in his favor, and I would bet on Hisoka. But what about you? Let me know who you think would win in the comments below.